What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon, DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance Crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today we're going to be getting into a video that someone did request. I don't have their name in front of me right now. This was something that was requested a bit ago. I think it might be on a request thread. I'm sorry. If I do find it, I'll try to leave it in a thread or something, or in a comment or something, so that you know who left the comment. But I just wanted to go ahead and tackle this. Right now, I'm kind of in a situation where I wasn't planning on making videos today, but I decided to just get up and record because I know tomorrow I'm going to get back into my workouts, and because of my schedule, I already have a very tight schedule to begin with, but on work days it's very tight, so I have to squeeze in my schedules at like a specific time. Right now I'm planning on like working out and stuff after I get off work, and that is at like 3 o'clock in the morning, so I'll probably start working out at 4. Probably won't even have a chance to record videos until like 5 or 6 in the morning. Try to edit them, upload them, everything else, and normally I don't go to sleep until like 10 in the morning, and then have to wake up at about 2:30 to get ready for work the next day. So very, very busy. This is going to be just a quick thing. I don't really have time to like look up stuff or anything like that. So this is the Tokyo trial explained. This video was done by History Scoop. I believe it tackles the subject matter of the war criminals during World War II that were part of the Japanese Empire. Already did the Nuremberg trials for the German war criminals. Now, everybody's going to say, well, you know, all parts of the war had war criminals, and that is true. The Soviet Union had war criminals, the United States had war criminals, and the UK had war criminals. Everybody pretty much has done something or had someone in their group that did something that would be akin to war crimes. It's just, you know, with history, you have your winners and you have your losers, and because they were on the losing side, they're the ones that got held accountable, and there were a lot of heinous things that were done by the winning side that went unpunished. But bottom line is, these are the people that were caught, and this is the trial that took place to determine what happened to them. Let's go ahead and jump into this and see what it has to offer. I've known about the Nuremberg trials, but I've never heard about the Tokyo trials until somebody brought it up, but it makes sense it would exist. Anyway, let's jump into this. Before I get into it real quick though, I will have a link for the channel, History Scoop, at the end of this video. The last 30 seconds, an icon will pop up. You can click on it, go to their channel, like, comment, subscribe, all the other good stuff. And I will have a link for the original video in the description box down below, in case you want to watch it without me talking or pausing, or if you're a reactor yourself and you want to do a reaction to it. Anyway, let's do it.
The Tokyo trial saw the end of the Japanese Empire's brutal regime. It helped lay the foundation for international criminal law and the International Court of Justice. And it was only the second time in history an international tribunal sentenced people to prison and to death. But yet, it's barely mentioned in history. Today, I seek to change that.
That's true.
Japan had been living in a self-imposed isolation for centuries, until 1854, when the USA forced it to open its ports and markets. Japanese leaders, realizing just how weak they had become compared to the rest of the world, created a plan to rapidly westernize, modernize, and industrialize. As Japan's economy grew, it soon ran out of the resources to run that modern economy. As a result, Japan would fight several wars to gain access to foreign resources, and eventually taking over a large part of Asia, until its defeat at the hands of Allied powers. As the Japanese army moved across Asia, it became apparent that they were committing atrocities on a massive scale. Slave labor, comfort women, massacres. When the tide of war had turned, the leaders of various powers came together to declare that the leaders of Japan will be punished.
I was watching a video not too long ago that asked the question of why was Japan not split apart like Germany was after World War II? Because when you think about it, like every piece of the winning nations had like a bit of control in Germany. You had the United States, the UK, and France controlling Western Germany. You had the Soviet Union controlling Eastern Germany. Why wasn't it split up like that in Japan? And I believe the answer to that question was, well, United States wanted control of Japan because, one, they did most of the fighting in that area. The other powers weren't really involved. And Two, the United States had the nuclear bomb, so wasn't nobody going to question them about it anyway. Like, yeah, they said they want it. Fine, take it. You can have it. But that's pretty much the sum of it that I saw about it. It was a video. I forgot which one it was, but it was interesting. Like, yeah, Japan. I mean, United States kind of like flexed their muscles when it came to like control of Japan, and it kind of worked out because Japan ended up becoming I mean, they had their economic boom after that. They kind of became like a very sweet country. like everything about Japan just seems very lovable now, and it's like it's hard to see them having this really dark past. But yeah, it's interesting.
But the details of this were left vague. When Japan surrendered, the US came to occupy the island nation. And so the question of how Japanese leaders would be punished fell mostly to the USA. And the USA decided to largely copy the system used to punish the German leadership after World War II, called the Nuremberg Trial. It was a military tribunal to prosecute Germany's leaders for war crimes. If you want more information, there's a link at the end of this video. And so the USA established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or simply called the Tokyo Trial. And with that came the question of who would participate in the trial. Well, it was decided that only the 9 countries who signed the surrender of Japan would get to sit in judgment over Japan, as well as India and the Philippines, colonies of the UK and USA respectively, who had also been fighting in the war. And so the tribunal would have 11 judges and 11 prosecution teams from each of the 11 countries. They came from Australia, India, Canada, China, France, Netherlands, New Zealand, Philippines, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States. The defense, however, was comprised of 1/4 US lawyers and 3/4 Japanese lawyers. Next came the issue of exactly which crimes a person could be indicted for. After all, most of the atrocities weren't committed by the men on trial, but rather by the soldiers. And so it was determined that a person could be indicted for 3 types of crimes. Crimes against peace, such as planning, preparing, or initiating a war. War crimes, such as violating the rules of war like executing prisoners. And crimes against humanity, such as murder, enslavement, or deportation. Someone could be tried for any or all of them. However, a person would have to at least be indicted for crimes against peace in order to be tried at the Tokyo trial. Otherwise, they would be tried at lesser courts. For example, Hiroshi Oshima was the ambassador to Germany. This meant that he couldn't have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, but he did help in planning a war. Thus he was found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment, but paroled 7 years afterwards. He would die in 1975.
It's always interesting hearing stories about people who got sentenced to life in prison, but then you hear like, oh, but they got released 5 years later. Like, that's not life. Like, you promised the man would be in prison for the rest of his life. What's going on with that? But I believe in the United States, like, life is considered like 25 years. It could extend further than that depending on the level of the crime or if the judge feels that they want to extend it more. But usually life refers to 25 years, right? I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure. It's not like I have a lot of experience in the damn justice system, so I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe it's 25 years.
Or take the case of Akira Muto. He helped plan several wars and commanded an army in the Philippines where his troops conducted a long list of atrocities. Thus, he was found guilty on all 3 types of charges and sentenced to death. And then came the question of how long ago an atrocity could have taken place. After all, Japan had been fighting wars since the 19th century. Not only would gathering evidence be difficult, the oldest men on trial were teenagers during the first wars. So it was decided that the leaders could only be indicted for crimes committed after 1931. For example, Koki Hirota served as foreign minister and prime minister before the Second World War, but he was still indicted for crimes committed before his retirement. Hence, he was still found guilty of crimes against peace and for waging war against China in the 1930s, and he was sentenced to death. In total, 28 men were indicted, 18 senior military leaders, 9 senior political leaders, and 1 scholar. But none.
I don't recognize him off the pictures. I'm sure he's probably here somewhere, but I wonder where Hideki Tojo is. I think that might be him right here. I could be wrong, but I think that's him. The reason why I asked that is because I, like, watching this video, it made me think, I don't ever remember hearing about, like, how his story ended. Like, I know that he was, like, the leader of the military pretty much during that period, and at the time the military had more power than even the emperor, who I didn't know exactly how his role worked. Looking at it like after the fact, like how the emperor of Japan kind of was like, I don't want to say forced to go along with everything that was happening at the time, but he didn't have nowhere near as much power as like people portrayed him as. Like, it was mostly the military that was doing their own thing, and I believe Hideki Tojo was the leader of the military. I don't remember ever hearing about what happened to him, like if he died immediately after World War II, if he was captured and executed, or if he was if he escaped. I hear Argentina is a very lovely place to visit around that time, I guess. I don't know the full story about how his life ended, but maybe they'll go into it.
None of them were from the imperial family. The USA determined that having the emperor on the throne would make occupying and reforming Japan a lot easier. So even though the emperor and his family were co-conspirators in almost all indictments, the USA decided against prosecuting the imperial family. And not even the defendants would put any blame on the imperial family, as they didn't want to portray the emperor in a negative light. If they did comment on the emperor, then there would only be 2 outcomes.
I believe the emperor's son recently stepped down because of age, right? He stepped down in Japan, and I didn't remember hearing about anything after that, but it, like, for me, it was crazy thinking like, oh man, this guy who was the leader of Japan during Japan's darkest period still had a somewhat connection to the throne. And I mean, technically, I didn't even know that Japan still had an emperor. Like, I thought that was over with, but not only realizing they still had an emperor, but the person that's the emperor is the son of the guy that was considered leader of the worst time in Japan. And it was like, oh, eye-opening.
Negative light. If they did comment on the emperor, then there would only be 2 outcomes. Either they would admit that the emperor was involved, or they would admit that they acted without the emperor's knowledge and thus committed high treason. And so, both the prosecution and the defense avoided the issue altogether. But they weren't the only ones who escaped indictment. The leader of Japan's Human Experimentation Unit also wasn't put on trial. They performed lethal experiments to test the limits of the human body, with methods too gruesome to mention in this video. The USA wanted the research results, and so traded the results in exchange for immunity of all members of the unit. I left a link in the description with the Wikipedia article for more information, but be warned, the testimonies are quite gruesome, and other websites do have images of the victims which you probably wish you had never seen. The arrest of the 28 men who were indicted didn't happen smoothly though. Hideki Tojo attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the heart. He was prime minister from 1941 to 1944, presiding over most conquests of the western colonies in Asia, as well as various massacres. He believed that the war was justified, and did not want to submit himself to a foreign tribunal whom they had just fought a war against. Hideki Tojo, however, missed his heart and was resuscitated shortly afterwards. From then on, any arrest would be accompanied by medical professionals, so no war criminal could escape justice by hiding in death. Hideki Tojo accepted full responsibility in order to protect the emperor, was found guilty, and sentenced to death. The judges had assembled. The defendants were gathered, and the lawyers were ready.
Okay, so
The trial
I'm
would
guessing
take
he's got
2.5 years, during which 2 defendants died of natural causes in 1946. They were Yasuke Matsuoka, a diplomat who was one of the architects of the Tripartite Pact, and Admiral Osami Nagano, who oversaw the entire Japanese Imperial Navy. Another defendant was deemed mentally ill and unfit for trial, Shumei Okawa, a scholar who was put on trial for his influence over Japan's propaganda program. He acted oddly in court, such as wearing his pajamas or slapping a fellow defendant on the head. He was released from a mental hospital in 1948, spent his later years translating the Quran into Japanese before passing away in 1957. Whether he faked his perfectly timed mental illness remains unknown. The trial started with the prosecution presenting its case, spending over 6 months to present all the evidence against the defendants. Their job wasn't easy. As soon as the war ended, Japan's government ordered all troops to destroy any evidence of atrocities. As a result, the prosecution couldn't rely on direct orders of atrocities. So instead, they built their case around the idea that the atrocities were consistent, widespread, and strikingly similar. By proving this, the prosecution wanted to show that such acts could have only been committed if the Japanese government had ordered these massacres. After all, if atrocities were common and similar, then there would need to be some sort of central authority directing these similar acts. But even if that were true, that still wouldn't prove that these men on trial were personally responsible. Theoretically, it was possible that only a few of them directed atrocities while the rest were innocent. So the prosecution tried to prove 3 things for each of the defendants. 1. That the defendants were aware of the atrocities. 2. That the defendants had the power to stop these atrocities. And 3rd, that the defendants did nothing to prevent these atrocities.
Now I can see the defense trying to make an argument against the middle one. They had the ability to stop the atrocities because I believe in Japan it's like they were said to be doing everything for the emperor, and the emperor was considered like a holy divine being at the time. And by denying orders from the emperor, it would be like denying orders from God. So they would probably be killed themselves by turning down those orders. Now, of course, it would all have been bullshit. I'm just saying this is a defense they probably could have used to try to get themselves out of it. I don't know how effective it would have been, but I'm willing to bet that is, something. I mean, it's pretty much no different than the Germans' defense of I was just following orders, except in this case it was more of a Blues Brothers. We were following orders from God.
And of course, there was almost no evidence that these men ordered any atrocities. But the prosecution was able to prove to the court that almost all defendants did nothing to prevent the atrocities while having the power to do so. Meaning that they were negligent in their duties to uphold the rules of war as laid out in various treaties before the Second World War. The defense lawyers, however, fought adamantly for their clients, with one lawyer being quoted as saying, "I intend to hang 27 of the accused to save my client." They argued that the court wasn't impartial enough, with the Philippine judge being a victim of Japanese brutality who couldn't be impartial in his verdict, according to the defense. Their request to replace the judge, however, was denied. But they went further, arguing that the trial as a whole did not hold any legitimacy.
I think it's about time that Filipino judge, reserved the right to be the judge this time. I mean, I'm sure when he was on the other end of it, you guys didn't become very impartial when it came to what you did to him, so I'd say it's about time he got even. Not really the best thing as far as, a justice system, but when it comes to karma, that's perfect justice.
But they went further, arguing that the trial as a whole did not hold any legitimacy, stating that even if the defendants were negligent in their duty, that they couldn't legally be held accountable. They pointed out that many of the countries on the tribunal, such as France, the Netherlands, the UK, and the USA, were only on the tribunal because they colonized Asia, and they colonized Asia through aggressive wars of their own. The defense therefore argued that Japan's wars were no different than Western wars. So why should Japan be held to a different level of accountability than the rest of the world? The defense also attacked the notion that Japan was fighting wars of aggression. Instead, they explained that for centuries, Europe and the USA had invaded Asia, attacking Japan's neighbors one by one, and that Japan was being threatened by Western imperialism. They explained that Japan was an isolationist country for 220 years, until those powers forced Japan to open its markets to foreign trade. And when Japan was forced to modernize and industrialize to keep up with the invading Western powers, Japan had to invade its neighbors for the resources it needed for its survival.
Now, of course, that argument falls to pieces once you get to the point of, doing human experiments and genocides and massacres and things like that. That kind of destroys your argument, but had you not done that, you would have had a very solid argument and, could have even probably won. But, yeah, you kind of fucked yourselves over with the whole, human...
Just as Western powers had done. They argued that the USA cut off oil supplies to Japan as long as Japan was occupying the mainland of Asia. With only 2 years of oil supplies left, Japan was facing extinction, and so Japan was left with only two choices. Either Japan wasn't going to go to war, in which case Japan would certainly perish, or they would go to war, in which case Japan might perish. If they perished without war, then Japanese culture would perish as other powers would dominate the island nation. But if they perished in war, then its people would rebuild their nation to once more rise to prominence another time.
Real quick, I wonder, this flag right here, I know that's like the flag of the Japanese military. Do they still use that flag? I imagine they probably retired it because of the, connotation it has with that period in time. But I'm wondering if, this is their national flag, but this is, their wartime flag. Obviously I can look it up. But as I told you guys, by the time I get these videos done and edit it and everything else, and usually I have other videos I record after this or before it or whatever else. By the time I get done, this little tidbit completely slipped my mind. So that's why I ask these questions in the video, because you will leave a comment and then it'll bring me back oh, okay, I remember when I asked that. Thanks for answering it.
With the USA forcing Japan into these two options, Japan chose to go down fighting. And so, the defense argued, the blame of the war did not fall upon Japan, but rather, the blame of Japan's war against Western nations was the fault of the USA forcing Japan to go to war. Therefore, it should not be Japan, but the USA who should be put on trial. There were various versions of this argument made by various defense attorneys, but all of them would follow a similar line of reasoning.
Your argument would be okay if you were, being attacked, but you weren't. You were going out taking over stuff, so you were very much being aggressive, and that's not a case of, we were just defending ourselves, because to my knowledge, China wasn't attacking you, or they didn't come out and initiate any type of attack. Vietnam wasn't attacking you. Korea wasn't attacking you. The Philippines wasn't attacking you. All those areas, they weren't attacking you. You went out and attacked them first, so it kind of kills your entire argument of, defending yourself.
But when it came to the atrocities committed during the war, the stories of the men were very different. Some claimed to not have known about them. Others claimed that they were justified. For example, Iwane Matsui was commander of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force during the Nanjing Massacre. He defended himself with, "It is just the same in a family when an elder brother has taken all he can stand from his ill-behaved younger brother and has to chastise him in order to make him behave properly." He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. while others testified that they did indeed try to stop massacres and therefore weren't guilty. For example, Mamoru Shimegitsu actively tried to prevent war with the Western powers, but the prosecution argued that he didn't do enough, that he could have stepped down, relinquish power, and choose not to remain part of the system. The court agreed and sentenced him to 7 years in prison. He would be paroled after only 2 years, got back into politics, and served as foreign minister and deputy prime minister before passing away in 1957. After 225 days of the defense presenting their argument, it was time for the judges to determine the innocence or guilt of the 25 remaining defendants. If over half the judges voted a person was guilty, then they would be sentenced. Out of the 55 different charges which could be brought against any of the defendants, the court ruled that 45 of them were either redundant or not authorized by the court, and most of the defendants would be acquitted on several charges brought against them. A total of 7 defendants were sentenced to death. Among those not already mentioned were Kenji Dohaira, chief of the intelligence services in Manchuria and instrumental for planning its invasion and occupation. He turned Manchuria into a vast criminal enterprise where assault, sadism, and a long list of other crimes became commonplace. Seishiro Itagaki, an important figure in the occupation of Manchuria. Haitaro Kimura, commander of the Burma Area Army who played an important role in the invasions of China and Southeast Asia. 18 defendants were sentenced to prison. Among those not already mentioned were Sadao Araki, served in various wars before the Second World War, sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released after 7 years due to ill health and passed away in 1966. Kingoro Hashimoto, major instigator of the Second Sino-Japanese War, sentenced to life imprisonment, released 7 years later, and died in 1957. Shunroku Hata, commander-in-chief of the China Expeditionary Force which committed wide-scale atrocities under his command, sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled after 6, and died in 1962. Kiichiro Hiranuma, served as Prime Minister and Chief of the Supreme Court of Japan, sentenced to life in prison, paroled after 4 years, and died shortly after his release. Naoki Hoshino, as Chief Secretary of the government, he was highly involved in Japanese war preparations. He was sentenced to life imprisonment but paroled 10 years later. He would go on to serve as president and chairperson of several companies before passing away in 1978. Okinori Kaya, Finance Minister. He prepared Japan's financial, economic and industrial policies for war, sentenced to 20 years in prison and paroled after 7. He rejoined politics and became Minister of Justice after being convicted of war crimes. He died in 1977. Koichi Kido, one of the closest advisors to the emperor, sentenced to life imprisonment, released due to ill health 5 years later, and passed away in 1977, 24 years later.
How the heck? I wasn't really paying attention to like when the Tokyo trials took place. I would imagine it was like somewhat after World War II, maybe within that 5-year period of World War II ending. How the hell are you released 5 years later from your sentencing date due to ill health, but then you stick around for another like 20 years? Unless the Tokyo trials took place in like the 60s, which I doubt it did. Okay. Unless he caught like some type of illness that messed him up, but he was able to still technically live with it for a long time. I don't know.
Kuniaki Koisho, governor of Korea, sentenced to life in prison, where he died 2 years later. Jiro Minami, Minister of War. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled 6 years later, and died in 1955. Takazumi Oka, Minister of the Navy, given a life sentence but was paroled after 6 years in prison and passed away in 1954. Kenryo Sato, Chief of the Military Affairs Bureau, sentenced to life imprisonment until his parole 8 years later. He passed away in 1975. Shigetaro Shimada, Minister of the Navy, sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled after serving 7 years, and died in 1976. Toshio Shiratori, Ambassador to Italy, found guilty of conspiring to wage war and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison a year later in 1949.
See, this is real serious subject matter, so I'm trying to hold back, but every time I see a picture, I'll be thinking about, like, roast their ass. Roast their ass. Like, I'm ready to go in on them. Like, I'm ready to do just say all types of crazy random shit about their photos, but I'm a hold back, you know, trying to stay somewhat respectful for the subject matter at hand and keep it serious, but just know
Yoshijiro Umesu, Chief of the Army General Staff, sentenced to life imprisonment. He also died in prison a year later in 1949. Shigenori Togo, Minister of Foreign Affairs, staunchly against the war with Western powers, he repeatedly advocated for both peace before and during the war. While he informed his superiors of the war crimes he was aware of, the court concluded that he didn't do enough. Sentenced to 20 years in prison and passed away 2 years later in 1950. Teiichi Suzuki, primary planner of Japan's wartime economy, sentenced to life imprisonment but paroled after serving 7 years. He briefly rejoined government service and passed away at the age of 100 in 1989. With him died the last of the Tokyo trial defendants. The 7 men sentenced to death would receive their punishment about 6 weeks later, on December 23, 1948. The 7 men were executed by hanging, each dying instantly. No photographs were taken of these men after their executions, with the leader of the occupation force fearing it would embarrass or antagonize the Japanese people. Instead, 4 members of the Allied Council would act as official witnesses. Their bodies were cremated, and so ended the Japanese imperial regime. If you like this video, I also made one on the Nuremberg trial, which you can click on here. And if you want to see more videos like this, like the video, subscribe, and press the notification bell.
Got my video skipped for a second. Maybe that was like a somewhat of an outtake that got like slipped in. But yeah, like I said, I knew nothing about the Tokyo trials, and based on some of these sentences, how they said some people were sentenced and died in prison in 1940 something, I'm guessing I was right when I said the trials took place somewhere within those first few years of the war ending. So probably around like 46, maybe the end of 45, 46, somewhere around there. So yeah, I had no idea how the dude was able to get out on bad health but still live all the way until the damn 70s. When you have other people in here that they say like died in prison 2 years later and stuff, and it's weird, but whatever. Yeah, like there's more details about the stuff I want to listen to look up on, especially like that dude that they said was in charge of the like human experiments. Because like I say, he sounds like a Joseph Mengele type of character, and if that is the case, then this is someone I want to read about because I've never heard of him. And given the fact that he is almost an heir apparent, we should make this person just as hated and vilified as Mengele was. So yeah, I might have to do more research on him. I don't think they gave, well, I'm sure they gave a name. I'd have to go back and look up the name, but yeah, I have to read more about him and some of the stuff that was said to have taken place. But just know that because I'm reacting to this or whatever else, it doesn't mean I have a problem with Japan or the Japanese people or anything like that, because Japan, much like a lot of Asian countries, when you talk about like culture and history and things like that, they have one of the richest on earth. Like one of the things I love the most about Asian countries is just how deep their culture and heritage goes, and I'm a big fan of that. So I love like studying it and looking into it, and you know, just like interacting with people from there, and especially somebody that's a fan of the history and like have studied a lot about it and can like sit down and tell you about it. That's something I'm a big fan of. And because these people in this trial were responsible for these things and some of the soldiers that committed it and things like that, I don't hold all of Japan for what they did. Like, those people deserve every single consequence they got, and some deserve even more. But when it comes to the country as a whole, the people as a whole, I don't hold everything against them. That goes with everything. Like when it comes to, even with like Germany, I'm sure there were people in Germany that were not down with the Nazis' ideas and wanted to go through with it or anything like that. I mean, don't get me wrong. Anybody that actually committed anything as far as an atrocity, even if you weren't down for it, you're still just as guilty as far as I'm concerned. I'm talking about the people that weren't like involved in it, but were still technically associated with Germany. Like people that never committed any war crimes or anything like that, but still lived in Germany at the time. Like I have no problem with those people. So yeah, it's like I don't want like anybody watching this be like, oh well, you just how dare you talk about Japan because your country did just as bad stuff. And you're right, America did. Well, I don't want to say just as bad because, or at least when it comes to this time period. You talk about other time periods, that's a different story. But when it comes to the World War II era, America still had some atrocities. There were war crimes committed on America's side, but I would be willing to bet that they were on the scale of Japan and Germany. And there probably were some figures that deserved to be brought in front of a tribunal and judged. And that goes throughout like all of history. There are people alive today that have committed war crimes that to this day I'm still like, yeah, somebody needs to hold that person accountable. I don't think it's right that you can sit there and try to pretend to be the beacon for justice and fairness around the world while at the same time letting people who commit war crimes slide simply because they were associated with America, and America happens to be like the police force of the world today. There needs to be some type of accountability. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. I look forward to seeing you guys on a future video, and until then, I am Devon DaVinci, and I'm signing out. Deuces.